So how does art history work? Well, ideally, it works as I said. There is an artist, she, he, there. They create a piece of art which exacts emotional responses from a large number of people in their time, because people find the conflicts of their time mirrored in the impressions they receive from that piece. There are specific discussions, multi-layered discussions going on at any point in history, collective discussions, and they find them summed up in a work of art. They find somehow that this piece of art connects to the complex condition of their time. Theoretically. Practically, how does history work? History, practically, is a narrative that is based on very little data. The further you go back, the fewer the data get. I mean, like 99% of human history is a data gap. It gets a bit better when you get closer to our own times, but it's still a data gap. For example, I don't know if you know this, but there is a branch of archaeology that is called the archaeology of the present. Because just going back only 90 years, archaeology, like finding, retrieving, and interpreting objects from the past can tell us stuff about everyday life 80, 90, 100 years ago that we don't know anymore. They were not considered important, we didn't listen to our grandparents, or they didn't listen to their parents, then didn't tell us. There is a lot of stuff that doesn't get recorded, even though it impacts the lives of almost everyone, because it is not considered important. Similarly, the stories that get told and retold to make up history are not everybody's stories, because not everybody gets to tell their story, of course. That becomes especially obvious when it is about art history, because art history was more important before new media, obviously, before the advent of even the newspapers, before the invention of electronics, before social networks and so on, before television. Art was much more important, and a lot of artists were considered, they were notorious, they were famous, they were like Beyonce, whatever, in their impact. And who became important, and who was talked about, and who was considered somebody who was able to sum up what the feelings of a certain period and its complex problems were all about, was not everyone. And a lot of knowledge and so much experience is lost in that process. Because of course, the people who are not in charge, the people who are not top dogs, the people who are not, the ones who get pampered and served and who have all the money and all the privilege, those people know so much more about the reality of your time than the others. Because power makes blind in many, many ways. It is much more difficult to see a lot of structures and to know people when you have power. The more power you have, I'm convinced of that, the more difficult it gets. So, this is the problem of history. So, history, one, is a huge data gap, one, because we're lacking so much evidence. I mean, up to a certain point, there is even no writing. We just have objects that we have to interpret. That is all archaeology. Finding, retrieving, and interpreting odd objects. Second, there are written records starting something like 6,000 years ago, 4,000 before our time. There is, of course, discussion about what is proto-writing and what is considered to be a real writing system. Mostly, like, common agreement is that writing originated in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, like around Baghdad, famous place, for its own stories, good and bad, and also in Northern Africa, in Egypt. So that's when writing starts. It kind of helps, though a lot of the early writing is a lot of bookkeeping, or also myths, or also court files. So writing helps, still. Lots of data gaps, because from the early Phoenicians, as I said, we have a lot of bookkeeping. So we know a lot about wheat, amounts of wheat traded and levied for taxes and so on. But we still don't know what normal people thought about the law or about their society. We still don't know how daily life was organized. We don't know how not daily life. We don't know how their state was organized. Or take the 18th, 19th century. Not so long ago, really. 100, 200 years, not long ago. We know a lot more, so much more about how society was organized, how people made laws, what they considered important. We even have diaries. We know about people's personal innermost thoughts about their daily lives because they wrote about it. But, of course, we only know about people who, A, were able to write, B, had the time to write, C, could afford to write, and, very important, D, whose writings were preserved, whose writings were not, just after they were dead, used for kindling to lighten the fire, or, I don't know, to stuff their children's shoes which were full of holes, whatever. Their stuff was considered important and was preserved by family, by archives, somehow, because they had been considered important either privately or publicly. And again here, you see, again here is, you get a voice if your environment thinks you're worth listening to. That is what makes a voice. So, that means that we do not really have that kind of testimony from the majority of people, because until the 20th century, the majority of people could not write, of course did not have time to sit down and write, and probably also didn't have the spare money to buy paper, mostly. Yeah? This makes the data we have a very, very skewed account. It's completely reduced. It is very, very lopsided. It is definitely not a leveled impression that we get here. This is very, very much biased in favor of the privileged, rich, educated, and considered important. Which means that we don't know, or know much less about everybody else. And that still is shaping our presence. Our present times are shaped by the data gaps in the past. First, because they shape our idea about the past. I mean, even look at our history movies. They're all about, I don't know, all about rich people in silk dresses, because everybody likes to see those dresses. The majority of people never even got to lay hands on that kind of stuff. We're talking about 5 or 2%, which are presented to us as normal, as who we would have been if we had been alive then, in spite of our grandparents or our grandparents' grandparents at that time just being peasants or maids or, you know, people looking after horses or doing odd jobs or whatever. But this is the bourgeois fiction of our times projected back onto the past, which is what happens a lot when there are data gaps. When there are data gaps, when there are blind spots, then we assume, or we fill in the gaps according to what we think, according to our principles, according to what we think is normal. And what we think is normal is very interesting and very much up to debate. And it also should have nothing to do with history. For example, beautiful example, I love this example. Have you heard of Berka the Viking warrior? Berka the Viking warrior was discovered in a spectacular grave buried with the finest weapons imaginable. Mail shirts, several swords, two horses sacrificed to accompany the warrior into the other world. I think it was discovered in the 70s, and it made quite a splash. The thing about Burkhardt the warrior was that the skeleton was there, and the skeleton had the pelvis of a woman. Because, you know, our skeletons are pretty much alike, but there are some differences. One of them, most easy to spot, which even I can see, and you could see if somebody took the time to explain it to you, and maybe some of you can. The pelvis is different, wider, for obvious reasons. So, it was there for everybody to see. Of course, archaeologists learn how to spot a female or a male pelvis, of course. But their idea, the 70s male archaeologists' idea of what a Viking warrior should be was so strong, and it was so inconceivable to them that a warrior buried with two horses and no less could be a woman, that they interpreted the burial as the burial of a man. For decades, actually until 2007, until a DNA test finally brought the proof that the skeleton is that of a woman, the burial is that of a woman. And of course, then we had a lot of discussion. Yeah, maybe she wasn't really a fighter, you know, there must have been other reasons why she got these generous gifts to accompany her after death into the realm of the gods, and so on and so on. And here, what is interesting about that is that we have a lot of male burials with similar gifts, which are not questioned in the same way. Because, of course, the same thing could be true for a lot of men. You know, maybe it was just symbolic, just formal. Maybe they were just rich, whatever. Yeah? The point here is that the narratives of the present about who we are supposed to be, about what a woman can be, a woman cannot be a warrior, can be so strong that it even makes invisible the most visible and undeniable evidence. And that is what happens, what also happens when we talk about the past. So, data bias. I was talking about data bias. So, the data we have from the past are widely, profoundly biased in favor of the privileged, in favor of those who had access to precious material, those who were up in the hierarchy and could command others, those who could afford stuff, and those who were considered important, so that their deeds were preserved, their bodies were preserved, and their words were preserved, or their likeness, in the form of works of art or in the form of their output. And as I said, this data bias is still shaping the present, which is why it is important to know about it, not to forget it. For example, you and I, the women here, we have a 47% higher risk of getting seriously injured in a car accident. Why? Because cars are designed for male bodies. It's not because car designers are sexist or want all women dead or assholes, maybe a bit. It is because their design is based on statistics, on data, which have been passed along for a long time, and data which are based on the male body, taking the male body as the normal body, and women as a kind of special case, like a variant of the human race. Please remember, women at every time, 52%, biological women, 52% of the world's population, majority. So, and we also have that in other cases. We're much more likely to die from an undiagnosed heart attack because medical education and also medical software, increasingly medical software, is based on traditional medical data which go back 500 years, which did not really include female bodies except for obstetrics. And the typical symptoms for a heart attack, which even you could probably tell me, are, popularly and also in medicine, a strong pain in the chest that can even go into your left arm. Yeah, typical pain in the left arm and in the chest, heart attack. But these are the male symptoms. Women have different symptoms. So when you go to the doctor and are unlucky, they will not diagnose it because you show atypical symptoms, even though they are typical for your biological body. I know it sucks. I'm sorry, it's how it is. But back to the past. If you wanted your knowledge of the world, your experience to be part of history, you needed to fulfill several conditions. A, your knowledge needed to be preserved, put into words or images or shapes, and in shapes that wouldn't just vanish over time. So, like wood, paper, mostly out of it, if you want it to last longer than 100 years, or unless you are in a desert where textiles are preserved and so on. But mostly, for example, here in Northern Europe, nothing remains, or very, very little, just a few findings from bogs where the textiles didn't decay so much. But we don't, there are huge, again, huge data gaps because if you go back far enough, there is so little left, just mostly a few metal and stone objects. So, if you wanted to pass something on to future generations, it had to be made in durable material, which normally means A, metal or stone, expensive, they are hard to work with, you needed to be able to pay specialists to do this for you or to be able to do it yourself. And B, then you needed to be important enough so that future generations would care for what you left, or the object needed to be important enough so that future generations would care about it, or that object needed to become important again and again. And that is what we today call a classic, something that is interpreted and reinterpreted and revived by one generation after another. But in order to become a classic, whatever you left had to make it to other generations first. It had to become part of discourse. It had to become public. Here we go again, discourse, public. And there are a few very interesting stories from just the 19th century about what kind of story gets told and what story doesn't. And this is also shaped very much by what your heirs do to what you left. And that is also very much shaped by what they consider appropriate. For example, Emily Dickinson, one of the most famous North American poets, one of the most famous poets of the American language in general. She spent a rather quiet life in her family home in Massachusetts, hardly ever went out, never got married, and didn't even publish. Her works weren't published until after her death. I think in 1890 they were published. She died a few years before that. They were published by her sister-in-law. And her sister-in-law, no, sorry, yeah, that she was, her sister-in-law. And her sister-in-law also forged a kind of myth about the reclusive poet, the melancholy withdrawn poet who never left her home, who was kind of, you know, lived in poetry, had no other life, had no family, had no kids, had no lover, was this kind of sad spinster whose life would have been completely empty except for her powerful language and her incredible poetry. And then, a few years ago, a few feminist researchers looked at her letters, and Emily Dickinson's personal letters, which were in some archive, and had only been published once in a heavily edited version right after her death. And suddenly, looking at the originals, it turns out, oh my God, this was a completely different person. First of all, she immensely enjoyed life. That is clear in every line of her letters. She entertained a large network of friends. But you will notice still today that it's often overlooked. When a woman has no children and no direct family, she is considered to be alone, no matter how many friends she has. And then it also turned out that she had a lifelong lover. She had a lifelong love affair with her brother's wife. And this story had been considered unfit to tell, so it had been hidden, and her personality and her life had been completely misunderstood and had been overwritten for 120 years or so, because of what people considered proper and because of who told which story for whom. In this instance, it was not her brother who told the story. It was, I think, a nephew's wife. It was a female relative by marriage who did the editing, which was great, you know. I mean, this woman helped her to fame. Nobody might know this great poet. We don't know how much great literature was lost that way. Also, how many artworks were lost that way, like visual art. However, in order to do so, she saw fit to completely censor and edit the actual person, Emily Dickinson, and to replace her with an invented person that was more conformed to the times. And it is quite possible that in a way she did well. You know, in a way she did well because this myth about Emily Dickinson helped her popularity and helped her work to survive. And it might have been shunned and ousted if people had known that the biggest love of her life, apart from a few unconsummated loves for men, was with her brother's wife. Yeah, my God. She was, you know, adultery on top of it, inside the family. It was all wrong. Yeah. But of course, something is lost in the process. And what is lost in the process is the reality of this woman's life. And what is lost in the process is also this variant of human life. Same thing goes for example, is still true today. Similar. I mean, not like that. Of course, you can have as many affairs with women as you want to. You can get married. You can have kids. No problem there. But when it comes to publishing, it is similar. For example, Maya Angelou, another important, great American poet. Sorry, I'm coming with all these American female poets. That's just my example at the moment. So, Maya Angelou, poet, director, dancer, civil rights activist. Everybody in the States knows her. But in Europe, in Germany, she is nearly unknown. I mean, even people of great education don't know Maya Angelou, which sucks. You know, it's not what she deserves. But they know some minor idiot like Michel Houellebecq, forgive me, or they know a lot of other people. They don't know Maya Angelou because her work hadn't been translated and published in German until she died, like two or 3 years ago. Yeah, only now. It's published only now. It wasn't accessible if you didn't read English. So. Because she wasn't considered important. She was of color and she was a woman. And no matter how famous she was, there was still this idea, yeah, maybe that is too special. We don't know if this can appeal to a major public. We don't know if this will sell. Summary. One of the problems of history is that history is a narrative that consists mainly of a data gap. And the few data we have are completely biased because the data that survived are mostly about the experience of people with privilege, which normally, in the majority of cases in Europe, means male, white, rich, educated. And the less white, the less male, and the less rich, and the less educated people were, the less we know about them, the less they were considered important. So, history is about who has a voice. And having a voice is defined by A, who is considered worth listening to, and B, who considers their own experience and their own knowledge of the world worth telling. This also means that not only history, but most of the stories that we are telling and that we are being told are about what is interesting for these people. Like white male, educated, rich, heterosexual stories. Which accounts for a lot of violence, and it accounts for a lot of stuff that is not being told. I mean, a lot of our narratives is about mating or war. And if we had a different culture, and if we had a different memory, if we had collected different data and focused on different data, we might be telling different stories. Our focus might, for example, be on communication with other species. If that had been important in the past, our planet would be completely different. We would be in a completely different situation now. And, for example, communication with other species is something about which have practically no data at all, even though this took place all the time. I mean, it's not even 100 years that the city that animals left the city. Of course, cities were shared with lots of animals for a long time, other than pets. Just as an example, if the focus were different, and maybe if people with different interests had more influence on the narrative that is our history, things might be different today. So, the data gaps in our narrative very much influence and shape our present. Examples are, as I told you, how dangerous a world designed for male bodies is for women, or how dangerous it is for male bodies not the right color. You know what the black man's disease is, right? The black man's disease is to die from a bullet for no reason at all. All this is due to structures, hierarchical structures. All this is due to the fact that certain people are considered more worthy and more important and more real. That certain bodies are considered more important and more real and more entitled than others. It also means that certain models of life are more accepted and easier and cost you less energy than others. A harmless example, for example, is that living in the countryside, it is much easier to manage your daily life if you have a car. Well, you say that is normal. No, that is only normal because we are used to it. Of course, we can imagine a world in which there is a different focus on transport and sustainability. Of course, we can imagine that. It would just mean that we as a society invest more energy and probably more money into designing different ways of transport. Come on, we are so fucking, sorry, forgive me, inventive. Of course we could organize this differently if it were important enough, but it isn't. So, you either have to own a car, and if you're too poor or too stubborn to own a car in the countryside, you have to invest more energy to get your daily life done. This stuff, this kind of structure, is also shaped by the biases of the past. And we call this hegemony. This is a concept by a brilliant, wonderful, privileged white man, Italian, Antonio Gramsci, who coined this term hegemony. And hegemony describes the fact that our societies are organized in a way that makes it easier and safer for some persons who have the right body and who have the right kind of background and who have the right amounts of money, that makes it easier and safer for them to live than for others. The further you deviate from this ideal body, which in our case is male, white, healthy, heterosexual, and rich and educated. The further you're different from that body, the more additional energy you have to invest to navigate society. And of course, that sucks. And and even if you're close to the ideal, I think probably nobody, nobody has all that privilege. Not even white men, because there's so many white men who are old, or sick, or poor, or uneducated, right? So, this is a structure that favors certain people and disadvantages others for no other reason than tradition. And so some people profited from it and others don't. And this system shapes, of course, it shapes how we perceive the world, it shapes our decisions because of the energy that needs to be invested, it shapes how we see others, and it shapes our thoughts and our entire culture, which is how it happens that you can be racist or sexist even though you don't mean to, because we have inherited these structures. We have inherited structural racism and structural sexism. And in order to get rid of that, in order to get rid of it, to get it out of our thoughts, of our bodies, of our habits, of our language, we need to, become aware of it and invest a little work, which is not so easy, but it's worth it, because it will bring more justice into the world and it will make you more free to be yourself.